Hello and welcome to another episode of Brave UX. I'm Brendan Jarvis, managing founder of The Space in Between, the home of New Zealand's only specialist evaluative UX research practice and world-class UX lab, enabling brave teams across the globe to de-risk product design and equally brave leaders to shape and scale design culture. You can find out a little bit more about that at thespaceinbetween.co.nz. Here on Brave UX, though, it's my job to help you to put the pieces of the product puzzle together. I do that by unpacking the learnings, stories, and expert advice of world-class UX, design, and product management professionals. My guest today is Samuel Proulx. Samuel is the Accessibility Evangelist at Fable, a user research platform that connects people with disabilities with people who want to create a more accessible internet. Fable also provides those same people with custom training so they can gain the skills needed to build more inclusive products. At Fable, as Sam's title would suggest, he is responsible for evangelizing accessibility and inclusive design. This means keeping those subjects on the radar of our world's enterprises and helping them to see that accessibility can be more than an exercise in compliance. To that end, much of Sam's time is invested in writing articles, speaking at events, which is how we met, and providing valuable content like this to industry. He is also very involved in the broader accessibility community, including as a long-time moderator of the official subreddit for blind and visually impaired people. He is also the co-host of the Disability Bandwidth podcast and host of the Inclusion Hub podcast. Definitely check those out. I'll put links to them in the show notes. Recently named on Royal Bank of Canada's Future of Good 2022 list, Sam is one of 30 young impact leaders who have recently been celebrated as people creating impactful and positive change in their communities. In preparing for today's conversation and having recently heard Sam speak at Rosenfeld Media's Design at Scale conference, I understand why he is on that list. And now it's my great pleasure to have him here with me on Brave UX. Sam, welcome to the show.
Hey, lovely to be here. What an amazing intro. I think I'll just clip that out and use it as the intro for everything I do in future.
You are most welcome, Sam. It's all of your wonderful achievements. So be my guest. Be my guest. Hey, Sam, you're someone who, as far as I can tell, is a big sci-fi and fantasy fan.
Yes.
And I also understand that you are a gamer. So when you're not busy evangelizing accessibility, you spend a bit of time playing games.
Sure do.
What's the last game that you played?
Oh boy, I'm about to get into the new release of The Last of Us because they made The Last of Us 2 accessible. And now that The Last of Us 1 is being remastered, they're adding accessibility to that. I also, over the summer, kind of played a bunch of Hearthstone, as you do when you're off and you're not working. And there's a really interesting sort of empire building and kingdom management game called War Sim, which is available on Steam, that I put a bunch of hours into because when you get off work, what better to do than kind of more resource management, right?
100%. I try and not look at the amount of time that I've spent playing certain games because it scares me.
Oh yeah, I know. I mean, Steam's the worst. It says right there in your library, right? You spent 146 hours. Geez, thanks.
Hey, we both played Last of Us 2. What did you think about it?
First of all, to get the kind of obvious thing out that has to be said is that it is revolutionary in being kind of the first AAA console title that can be played completely by someone without vision. So, I mean, obviously that is revolutionary and needs to be stated up front. It's also because it's the first console title that is fully accessible. For me growing up, nobody in my family was a gamer. None of my friends were really gamers. And so I had never used anyone else's console or owned a console myself. When I took up gaming, it was all on the PC because games could be modded to add accessibility and the screen reader was on the PC and it wasn't on the console. And so it was also, I found it quite surprising how the kind of different UX and the different affordances of being on a console, like the first kind of 2 hours of my gaming experience was just getting used to that and, you know, like the way the PlayStation works. So it's all tangled up in there, but they did a really good job adding the accessibility features, of making it playable. at an incredibly high quality for something that is the first one, right? You always expect, oh, it's the first one, so we have to make a whole bunch of allowances because like it's the first and they tried really hard and like they got there, but there's all these problems. It didn't feel like a first one, if that makes any sense. It did feel very polished, and I think the reason for that is because they had a number of folks with disabilities testing it and making suggestions and providing feedback throughout the development process, so that when it got into my hands, it was obvious that other people with disabilities had played this thing before, right? In a real way, I wasn't the first because they'd been given feedback all the way through the process.
And that sounds like that made a huge difference. Like you said, you couldn't really discern whether it was a first or whether it was, in the one in a long line of these types of things. But like you said earlier, it was the first AAA console game that had been made fully accessible. So it's a real milestone. How has that advancement in making AAA titles on console more accessible, or accessible in their entirety, how has that changed the gaming industry?
I think it's done a few things. First of all, of course, The Last of Us 2 got a great deal of press and attention and fanfare for doing what it did. And so that started conversations at many other organizations about, well, can we do this? How can we do this? Second of all, it proved beyond a shadow of a doubt something that we in the accessibility community knew, but something that they in the gaming community didn't know, which is that it is possible to do this, right? It's not this impossible lift that's going to cost billions of dollars and just never be doable. This is something that is practical and an achievement and a milestone that can actually be reached. Because too often when you talk to gaming companies, right, they're like, oh, well, we can't. Like, it's not possible. There's no techniques. There's no guidelines. This is a totally uncharted road. And so now The Last of Us 2 has kind of created some examples and shown that this can be done. So it makes it harder for another gaming company to say, well, we can't, either to say that to gamers who are advocating to get access to things, or to say that to regulators, right, who are wondering, well, all of these years we've exempted games from all of the kind of accessibility regulations that we have because we've been told it's not possible. And I think The Last of Us 2's features have also proven that it is possible to make a game accessible without lowering the difficulty. Because too many times people think, oh, well, if I have to make it, if I have to like an auto targeting system and I have to do all this stuff for people who can't, what I'm doing is I'm nerfing my game. I'm making it easier so that these people who turn on accessibility mode, like maybe sighted players will just turn on accessibility mode to cheat because it's making the game easier so they can get a high score, right? And if you're a game designer, you're really against sort of people, quote unquote, cheating at your game. And so I think it's really proven that more accessible doesn't mean easier, or doesn't mean, doesn't have to mean reducing difficulty. It can mean reducing difficulty. It can mean changing difficulty, changing certain tasks, but it doesn't have to be, right? I think a really good example of that is The Last of Us 2. When you have the accessibility mode on, it kind of has ledge detection, so that even if I'm directing the character to walk straight off of a ledge and fall to her death, she just won't, right? And I mean, sure, maybe that's making it easier, but like, what sighted player is struggling to not walk their character off a ledge, right? Like, this isn't, you wouldn't turn that on and be like, ooh, this is a real cheat for me to get a high score, right? Like, it
sounds like an industry-led straw man argument. Mm-hmm. It's remarkable coming from an industry, and I know we said off here that we wouldn't come down like a ton of bricks on any company in particular, and in this case, it's an industry. Yeah. So don't let me get too dark on this. But it just strikes me to be a remarkable, in a bad way, excuse to be making from an industry that is so innovative in so many ways.
But I think that's
suggest that it couldn't be done.
Right. Well, but it's because I think industries don't. The gaming industry is very good at sort of creating these experiences and telling these stories. But like, how many UX designers work in gaming, right? And so I think that the gaming industry as a whole is only slowly getting to the point where they're realizing we can separate the stories and challenges in our games from the UX of our game, right? And so when you're making accessibility changes, often you're changing the UX, although now that I say that, maybe it's I'm thinking aloud here, but like maybe it's not as separate as I as you feel it is, because I know when I was playing The Last of Us 2, going back to that edge detection example, it actually felt like it sort of personalized the characters a little bit more for me, because if I try to walk them straight off a ledge, they just won't. And I found myself embodying some of these accessibility features in the character, right? Because in The Last of Us 2, you're not the character in the game, right? And so it's very easy to, oh, well, of course you won't do that. That's a dumb thing to do, right? Like,
Yeah, it's almost like it allowed you to get to another level. I don't want to suggest that children are a form of a situational disability. Gaming has recently introduced story mode. This isn't something I hadn't thought about before we jumped on the call, but story mode allows, in this case, it's one of my good friends who has far less time now that he's got 2 kids to play games than before, allows him to participate in the experience of playing that game without the difficulty that a person who had perhaps more time, a sighted person with more time, would experience.
and I think that's also something that we get into when we are talking about UX, when we are talking about design, when we are talking about experience, because gaming, you want the experience of playing a game to be different from the experience of watching a video on Netflix, right? Even in story mode, they keep enough interaction there that it's not like sitting down to watch a video. And so again, I think that gets into like we're separating the game from sort of the interface elements of the game and the control schemes and the other things. And I think also as the target audience for games begins to skew a little bit older, and like games are no longer just being marketed sort of exclusively at teenagers, male teenagers to be specific, right? I think game designers and game industries are also starting to realize that it's no longer their job to be sort of the fun police, right? What does cheating at a story game mean? It means you get to experience the whole story, right? Like,
100%.
So I think gaming companies are sort of letting go of this, like every game should have like brain busting puzzles. And if you can't solve the puzzle, it's because you're not good enough. And so you don't deserve to experience this game, right? Like,
Right. Yeah. It's that moving away from that purist type way of imagining what the user experience should be, and instead recognizing that we have a wide variety of people with various abilities and needs and wants, and we need to give them an experience that works for them.
yeah, and it really is a key change. I don't know if you're old enough to remember, right? In kind of the 70s and 80s, like the computer gaming magazines. And it was like you'd get a prize for being the first to solve this adventure game. And it was like a real bragging rights, right? To solve all these fiddly little puzzles. Or they'd have like, in the Infocom adventures of old, like that last lousy point, right? That was almost impossible to get. And you had to try everything to finally get it. And I think we're moving away from that.
Yeah. Hey, moving on to something else that you've been doing for a while now, and that is moderating the official blind and visually impaired community on Reddit. Just how long have you been doing that?
Oh boy. It was certainly before I started at Fable. So 6 or 7 years, I want to say.
That seems to me, I had a look at the community, which is very active. I think there's something upwards of 17,000
We are
members.
the largest gathering of blind and visually impaired people on the internet, as far as I can discern.
That seems like a lot of work.
Yes and no. The lovely thing about Reddit, and one of the reasons I was so excited to take this on, and I'm still excited to do it, is that the participants in the community get to have a voice in the way that they do not in any other form or communication system. So if there's a piece of content that's posted and I'm like, maybe this is off topic, I'm like a little bit dubious, you just leave it there. And if the community doesn't like it, they'll downvote it, and then it will get hidden and go away, right? Because the things with the most upvotes rise to the top. And so it lets moderation be done with a bit more of a free hand, because the community has a very easy way to express what they would like and expect from posts and comments, and really control for themselves what gets attention and what does not.
So you get to see these conversations and these topics that come up across time, and representative of, like you said, it's the largest online community of its sorts. Is there a particular personality that you've seen the community embody? Is it something that can be reduced to such a thing?
Short answer is no. And the reason is because there are communities of blind folks that are in places other than Reddit. And those places tend to be like, remember back in the day, you had like you'd start up a website and go, and it was like your forum that you'd run with like PHPBB or like whatever it was. And a lot of those still exist. But in order to know about them, you have to be somebody who is already embedded in the blindness community. And so that traditionally means that maybe you are someone who was born blind or who was blind as a child and has grown up being a person with a disability, being a person who is blind. Reddit is so open. If you have a Reddit account, you can just pop into Are Blind and you can post, and it's searchable and it's easy to find. And so we have people who have that experience, who are part of the traditionally quote unquote blind spaces in the traditional blind community. And we have folks who like got the diagnosis yesterday from their doctor that they'll be blind in 3 months. And now what? And so it's a very mixed group of folks who are at all different places in their journey of being a person who is blind, who is living life, of accepting and processing what it means to be blind and deciding what if anything, that identity means to you, if it's an identity you embrace, or if to you blindness is just a nuisance to be worked around. So it is a very mixed bag of folks. I think the only thing that the entire community has in common would be that we all tend to be very quick to downvote people who come into the sub and say, hey, I just thought of this great new idea for a product that would help blind people, and I have never spoken to a blind person, and I haven't done 3 minutes of research to see if this already exists, and what do you think of my great new product idea? I think there's a desire in the engineering communities, right? Oh, blindness is a problem to be solved. And so you want to get to solving without like looking at existing challenges and existing solutions. And so that happens all the time. And those poor folks get downvoted so quickly. I think that's the one thing that the whole community, I guess, has in common, maybe, is that frustration.
Right. You mentioned that the Reddit community it sounded like, and I don't want to put words in your mouth here, more open than some of the perhaps older or other communities of...
Maybe discoverable is a better word.
Discoverable. Okay, yeah, good word. That ability to be discovered for people who haven't been born blind and who have received, I think you used the term diagnosis, that in 3 or 4 months they may lose their sight, or they're likely to lose their sight. What is the most common question or concern that they have when they come to the community for the first time?
The first thing is that there is a lot of grief. I often consider myself to be lucky as somebody who was born blind, because I have never experienced sight. And so I do not have a loss to grieve. But I think that the loss of sight, in the same way, say, the death of a parent or a close relative, sticks with you. I think that it is perfectly possible to continue and have an excellent, wonderful, productive, amazing life as somebody who is blind, just as it's possible to go on if your husband or wife dies, right? But it is something that does stay with you forever and that you have to learn to process. And the big learning for me, that's been a learning for me as I moderate the community, because I tend to think like, oh, these people are just like they're way overblowing it. I mean, you can turn a screen reader on in your computer and you can learn to use a cane and you'll be fine. Like it has been a learning for me to really come to realize that there is a grief here at a legitimate loss. And by me accepting that these people who have the people who have lost their sight are feeling this grief, it doesn't mean that I'm accepting that my life is in some way lesser, or that their lives will be in some way lesser or less productive. But there is a grief there, and it is okay for those of us who are born blind to accept that people who are losing their sight have this grief and have to process this grief. And it does not take away from our abilities or our capabilities or quality of our lives. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It does, 100%. Now, you mentioned that you are someone who was born blind, and I think I've heard you use in the past the term completely blind.
Yes.
But let me know if there's a term that you prefer other than that.
I mean, so blind in theory means completely blind, but there has been this sort of shift into like, oh, well, visually impaired is the politically correct term for blind, right? And so it's sort of made the two terms interchangeable in a way that they didn't start off being. And it is something that I have posted about publicly, even on Reddit, and even as like part of our FAQ. Like, I will tell someone I'm blind. They don't want to be politically incorrect, so they will change it to, oh, he's visually impaired. And suddenly I get a large print menu with no braille, and my needs have not been met because you changed the label that I use for myself in an effort to be politically correct, right? The use of labels isn't in prescribing us or isn't in telling us what we can't do, but the effective use of labels is in making us able to do things and in making sure that we get the support that we need to do everything we want to do.
It also sounded like the swapping of the label from blind to visually impaired in your particular circumstance, it sounded like maybe there was a little bit of a affront to your identity in that person making that decision to refer to you different to how you prefer to be referred to.
Possibly, probably, but at the time it is almost certainly drowned out by the frustration in not getting the support that I need, right? Because if you're visually impaired, it means you have some vision. And so you might be able to read magnified high color contrast text, or you might be able to see lights and shadows, or, you might be able to like walk around a space without the use of a cane or something like that. And those things are not true for me. So when the label gets changed from blind to visually impaired, it is now setting up a whole bunch of false expectations in other people. And now whoever it is that I'm interacting with, who maybe had the label changed, by a third party, now has to feel the awkwardness of like, oh, well, we tried really hard to be ready for a visually impaired person. We're not ready for you, right? Like,
right. Yeah. The words really do matter.
But yeah, so when I say completely blind, I'm just emphasizing like no light perception, and just because those words have become interchangeable in that way.
Got it. Yeah, just so that people really truly understand what it is that you mean.
Yeah.
I want to come to your upbringing. I understand that your father, he worked at IBM.
Yes.
And that he is also blind. Was he also blind since birth?
Yes, he was. He was born blind himself, and the thinking at the time was that his blindness would not be heritable. And so it was a very great surprise when I was born blind, and the sort of nobody was expecting it. And there's like a rare disease database that I'm part of. But I don't know that it would have changed any of the decisions that he made necessarily. But I think it was just like an adjustment for him, right? When in the very first sort of few months when I was born, that like, oh, this is like a thing that I didn't know about myself, right? In a way.
Right. Yeah, a big surprise. You mentioned that you had recently recorded a podcast episode with your dad.
It's not out yet, but I've recorded it, yes.
Yeah. I'm really looking forward to having a listen to that one. I was curious about your relationship. So how did both of you being blind, how did it shape your relationship that you have today?
I mean, it's hard to say because it is the relationship that I grew up with. I'm an only child, so I have a very close relationship with both of my parents.
Me too. Me too.
Yeah, siblings really seem to change things, don't they, for like the parental relationship dynamic in ways that I don't think we as only children have come to grips with.
It's hard to say though, isn't it? Because you and I have only both grown up as only children.
Yeah, we've never had a sibling. So when you say how is your relationship different because you're an only child, you have to think to yourself, I don't really know because I don't have a sibling. I remember the sort of one of my earliest memories when I was like, I don't know, 3 or 4, because my mother is completely sighted. And so I had gone over to a friend's house and I was staying with them and we were having a sleepover and we were going to go out, I think to like a theme park or something. And we got in the car and my friend's father got in the driver's seat. And I said, what? Daddies can't drive? And just at that 3 or 4 years old, it had never occurred to me that my father didn't drive because he was blind, right? I had just, daddies don't drive, right? Like, just because my father was so normal to me.
The innocence of childhood and that almost that, I wouldn't say it's the ripping off of the Band-Aid, but it sounds at least to me to be one of those moments of realization as you grow up that the world isn't what it once was the second before you came to that realization.
Yeah, or the world isn't what you think it is, or the world, because for me it was that ripping off of that Band-Aid and that sort of realization when I was like 4, because back, in the 80s things were a little bit more conservative than they are today, and those sort of classic gender roles were alive and well. And it hadn't really occurred to me like how my father's blindness had changed them in some ways and reinforced them in others. And it, like, to me, it was just a normal, it's just how things work, right? Like daddy works and mommy cooks and mommy drives. Like that's, like when
That's
you're a
how it
kid,
is.
that's how it is.
Yeah.
That's how families work.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned driving, and this isn't something that I hadn't thought about before we jumped on, which is, hey, that's the beauty of conversation. How excited or not are you about the prospect of autonomous vehicles?
I am so mixed, and I have very mixed feelings. And first of all, I'll start off by saying, obviously, I am super excited about the potential one day for me to jump into an autonomous vehicle and get where I'm going and not have to, have a cab. And like the options for independent travel that it will unlock are incredible. And so I want my self-driving car yesterday, right? But at the same time, as somebody who's a person with a disability who works in this space, I am intimately aware just how difficult it is for self-driving cars to detect pedestrians who use wheelchairs, to time how long it will take a pedestrian who is on crutches to cross the street, to understand the way that someone with a walker moves. And so I sometimes feel like a hesitancy to talk about how great this would be for me, because in a very real way, it would be life-changing for me as a person who is blind, but if not rolled out well, could have tremendously deleterious effects on other people with disabilities. And I very much resist and push back against this idea that like accessibility is a limited pie and it has to be divided up, right? And we all have to like fight for our share of this limited pie, in the way that like when audio description was becoming a thing, people who were deaf had expressed worries that, well, if studios have to spend all this money doing audio description, there's going to be less money for captions, right? And so this feeling that like, oh, well, if blind people all advocate for self-driving cars, then deleterious things are going to happen to people who use wheelchairs, and things like that. And I think it's very important that we all advocate together, and that we really come to understand that a rising tide always lifts all boats, and that a self-driving car that is not good enough to detect a pedestrian in a wheelchair is not good enough for me to trust my life to, right? And that these things are connected, and that it's not okay to say, well, it's good enough for blind people now and these other people don't matter, because it's not that that's selfish, it's that that's not true. If it's not good enough to detect and understand these people, it's not ready for me as someone who can't see to put my life in its hands.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, it's not acceptable to have a self-driving car that is not able to recognize all humans or forms of life when it's scanning. Is this another example of ableism playing out in technology, in particular in engineering?
I think it is a very good example of systemic ableism, right? Because there is no engineer that wakes up and gets out of bed in the morning and says, I don't like people in wheelchairs, so I don't care if my electric car runs them over, right? There's nobody saying that. And there's nobody who gets up in the morning and says, I don't care about blind people. I don't like them. I'm going to make my website inaccessible, right? That's not what's happening, in the way that, for example, sometimes with racism, there are people who are bigoted and who will say, I don't like people of this ethnicity or from this place. Nobody's doing that with disability. What it is it's systemic. It's the AI systems aren't getting training data that includes people with disabilities. They aren't properly taking into account the people with disabilities that do exist in their training data, right? Because when you're training an AI system, you're training it for the 99%, and you're sort of intentionally excluding the 1% as like bad data. Yuta Treviranus has some great material about this, and about the way we need to rethink the way that we are using data to make sure that we're including the edge cases, because we're all an edge case in some way, right? And that AI will never be ready until it can do this. And so, yeah, I think self-driving cars are a very good example of the way people with disabilities are systemically excluded from our highly data-based society, right? We see it again in like exam proctoring software that thinks that I'm cheating because its eye detection thinks I'm looking away at something off camera, or that, can't recognize the face of somebody who has muscle difficulties and can't move half their face, or things like that. It's all systemic data-based exclusion in these cases, and it is exclusion that comes from not actively trying to be inclusive, right? Because if we're not trying to be inclusive, we're excluding by default. But the difference is that it doesn't take or require malice to exclude, right? It just requires not intentionally including.
Yeah, plenty of terrible things happen, not because people want them to happen, but because they don't do enough to consider what might happen if they take certain actions.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why sometimes the term ableism makes me a little bit uncomfortable. Because, I mean, I am a Canadian, and I don't know if you're familiar with some of the stories about the residential schools for Indigenous folks that have come up over the last few years.
It's interesting you mentioned that. I had Dr. Sam Ladner on the show earlier in the year, and Sam's grandmother was a teacher at one of those residential schools. And she and I had a conversation about that. I won't do Sam's grandmother's story justice today on this episode. But yes, I had heard of some of the atrocities that had happened in the state, under the state.
And that kind of racism feels very different and malicious and intentional in a way that the thing we're talking about when we say ableism is not. And so sometimes the term ableism makes me just a tad uncomfortable because people are ableism and they want to tie it to, oh, it's like racism or it's like chauvinism or it's like, right. But a lot of so many of these other isms are tied up in malice or in intentional dislike and distrust and genocide and a whole bunch of other things. People with disabilities have had that experience, of course. I mean, if you look at what happened during World War II, right, people with disabilities were included on the list of undesirables. But I think at least today in the technology industry, it's not that. And so is ableism really a great term? I won't say not use it, but I always use it with caution.
So it is different. And I understand what you pointing to there in terms of the origin or the source of it is not from that same place of ill intent. So if it is different, and if that term ableism or ableist isn't helpful or isn't being as helpful as it could be in certain contexts, what is a more progressive or more helpful, more useful way of talking about these issues specifically in technology circles so that we can achieve the outcome that we're not currently achieving with some of these technologies?
I mean, isn't that kind of the $1 million question, right? That's always why there's the temptation to use ableist, because like, oh, well, I know exactly what you mean when you say that. And then they usually move on to stop accusing me of this thing, right? Like, which is
puts
not...
people on the back foot, right? People get pretty defensive when they're called anything with an ist.
Yeah, and being defensive is not going to fix accessibility, right? Shame is you're feeling bad that your product is inaccessible is not going to fix it. So I'd rather we just get beyond you feeling bad. You know what I mean?
And just fix it.
And just fix it.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
We know it's a problem. Fix it.
Yeah, I think that's why in the technology space there's such a focus on the term accessibility, right? And to call a product inaccessible and to call a company inaccessible, or to say that somebody's not committed to accessibility or not committed to inclusion, because it describes that exact problem very succinctly, as in to say they are not doing, or in some cases refusing to do, a thing they should do and that they need to do, as opposed to saying they're actively doing something negative towards people with disabilities, right?
Right, yeah. Hey, I know we've been talking about the current state of technology, sort of way out there with where things might go with autonomous vehicles. I want to wind the clock back a little bit now, maybe around 30 years or so, and come back to your dad. I mentioned that he'd worked at IBM, and I understand that his job at IBM gave you access to some pretty radical technology for its time as you were growing up.
Yeah, I mean, I had the rare privilege of having access to all of it, whether it was, going to my dad's office and seeing the early mainframe terminals that printed things out on Braille paper, or the OS2 computer in our home, the early blindness specific note takers and braille displays and braille devices. My dad had one of the Kurzweil reading machines, which was like the first ever machine that could, you put a book on it and it could OCR the text and then sort of read it in this extremely robotic voice.
Do you remember the first time you used that?
Yeah, I was in, let's say like grade 2 maybe. And there was like a book that wasn't in braille that I was supposed to, read and like do a quiz on the next day. And so my dad put it on the reading machine and had the machine read it to me. I didn't like it. I'm like, it was getting half the words wrong. Can't mom just read it? Right? Like, because that's where I was. Like when you're in grade 2,
Yeah.
That's where you're at the time. And you're not thinking about sort of independence, because no child is thinking about independence, right? It feels like you're right to have your parent do things for you. It's so as you grow older, then you start having these thoughts about like independence and wishing I could do it myself and with more dignity. And that's one of the things that I was so lucky having my father being blind. It was not an adjustment for my mother to have a blind son, because she married my dad. Like, she knows what a blind person is capable of, right? Because there's so many children who grow up with disabilities where their parents don't understand that living an independent life is possible for them, and shelter them and don't bring them up to value those things. And so for me, helping me be more independent wasn't something my parents had to figure out what to do, right? The journey was me just getting, my very first computer, the Apple II, and then getting a Windows computer, and like transitioning to doing my assignments on the computer, and transitioning to like scanning in my own articles as opposed to having someone read them. But it was an easy and natural feeling transition for me, as opposed to like a worry, I guess.
I understand that the type of assistive technology you use most often is the screen reader.
Yep.
There's probably the clues in the name there, right?
Mm-hmm.
But just so that I'm crystal clear myself, and that whoever's listening to this episode is also clear on that, what exactly is a screen reader and how does it assist you?
Yeah, so a screen reader can output the text on the screen via synthetic text-to-speech voices, or if you have the correct equipment, as I do, in Braille. And the Braille, actually, these days, it's not printed out on paper anymore. It's a refreshable Braille display. So it has, 40 cells, and the Braille dots kind of, appear and disappear as like a screen. But of course, a screen reader, you don't want to read everything on the screen at all times, right? There's a lot of things on a screen if you think about it. And so that's why things like the focus is so important when you're thinking about UX, and like focus states, like when you press the submit button, where's the focus going to go? Because the screen reader will always try to read the element that has the focus. And so it also provides a lot of hotkeys to quickly jump around the screen, because when I say load your homepage, I can't visually glance at it, right? I'm at the top, and I don't want to like read from the top down and read everything. And so that's why there is such an emphasis around semantic markup, because I get, for example, a shortcut key that can jump me to the first heading 1 on the page or the first heading 2 on the page. And so, for example, when I go to a new web page, in order to replicate that visual overview, I'll tell my screen reader to just jump from one heading to the next. And, I'll pick, this heading is search results, so this is going to have the stuff I want underneath it, right? And so I'm never taking in the whole page or the whole screen all at once. I'm using the commands that the screen reader provides to allow me to interrogate the screen to go directly to the place that I want, or to get exactly the information that I need. And that is really dependent on like developers labeling things properly and using correct semantic markup, and like labeling it a button if it is a button, and things like that.
How much of your frustration, if you feel any, when you encounter a website that isn't using semantic markup correctly, as per the spec sheet, how much of your frustration that you experience on a regular basis is based on just the basics not being followed?
It can be quite frustrating. I think for me, as somebody who has been using a screen reader in one form or another for, over 30 years, I have, as you do, created quite a muscle memory, right? And so I know all of the tips and tricks. And so like if there's a web page with no headings, I know like, okay, there's 4 other techniques that I can try to work around this thing. And I don't even have to like think about it and problem solve my way out of it. Whereas for someone like we talked about earlier who maybe lost their sight last year and is learning to use a screen reader, like that's hugely frustrating for them because like, well, all the things that I learned don't work. It doesn't work the way they told me it would work, right? Like, and they don't have any of these techniques to fall back on. But the thing that really frustrates me is when the spec sheet is not followed in ways that I can't work around. So it's the form that I filled out and it says, please correct all the errors highlighted in red, right? Like, can't see the colors, so now I'm just stuck, right? It's the button that can't be pressed with the keyboard. And so, well, now what? It's the image that contains critical information and has no alt text. It's the CAPTCHA that I can't solve. It's the website where absolutely none of the buttons are labeled. So now I can't just work around an awkward user interface because I don't know what anything does. It's those things that are they're the frustration. I think it's a statement on kind of where the industry is at, that I am so used to having to perform all kinds of workarounds every day that it doesn't even sort of enter my sphere of awareness, right? Because it's just what I do. And I don't get frustrated until all the workarounds stop working.
So if anyone has thought in the past or currently thinks that things like form field validation don't really matter, what you're saying, it sounds like they have a direct impact on your ability to experience the digital world with dignity if they're not done in a way that is accessible.
They do. And they have a direct impact. And even when I can work around it, there's an impact in time. So if you can do something in 3.5 minutes that it takes me 12 minutes to do, can we really call that accessible? Well, I did it. I got through it. I accomplished the task that I set out to accomplish. But did I really have an accessible experience? Right? And I think the answer is no. Because if I'm going to work and live, I can't be taking 9 times longer to do a thing than it took you. It's been a very interesting journey for me as I work here at Fable, right? Because I when I started out at Fable, I was like one of the first employees directly after the founders, and now we're a team of 50. And so as companies grow, right, the work increases and the responsibilities increase. And it has actually been, I think a reversal is too strong of a word, but it has been an interesting reflection for me as I have had to say, well, I could do this, but it would take half an hour, and I can ask one of the colleagues on my team to do it and they'll have it done in 3 minutes. And so there are other things more valuable than my independence in performing this task, right? It's an interesting.
How does that sit with you? How do you feel about that?
I mean, we all wish we could do everything by ourselves, right? In an ideal world, I would be able to accomplish all of my tasks taking the same amount of time and cognitive effort as anyone else. And I think that's sort of the ultimate goal, is that everyone is having an experience online that is easy and that is efficient and that suits their particular needs. I don't want to, I've been focusing on time and this just as an example, but like, I don't want to focus on time because if maybe you're Stephen Hawking using a switch system, I mean, of course something is going to take you longer, right? And so we never want to like benchmark based on time, but we want everybody to be having a good, useful online experience as opposed to being frustrated and working around things and having blockers and not being able to accomplish tasks. And we want people to, competitive is the wrong word, but there shouldn't be a disadvantage, say, to a company hiring a person with a disability, right?
In that particular circumstance, why I sort of wanted to dig into that with you a little bit more, it strikes me as one where 100%, like you say, it shouldn't put anybody at a disadvantage. The technology shouldn't be putting anyone at a disadvantage, regardless of whether they have a disability or not. And that's the aim. But in this particular case, as Fable's grown, your responsibilities have evolved, which means your time, as you said, is better spent doing other things that you could be doing with that time. So in some respect, it seems like this weird tension between an increase in responsibility, which is taking your attention elsewhere and necessitating delegation, but some of the source of that delegation is actually coming from an unacceptable circumstance with the technology not enabling you to do those tasks.
Yeah, it's an interesting balance, right? Because you never want to fall into the trap that all delegation is wrong and bad, right? People who are busy hire someone to do their taxes, and then they don't have to do it anymore, right? But I think the key factor is that it should be my choice to delegate because I don't want to do it anymore, not because it is inconvenient or difficult for me to do.
100%. Yep, you've just cleared that up. Hey, I saw you give a demo of you using your screen reader, and there's that robotic voice that people have likely heard if you've accidentally, in my case, I enable voice dictation on my Mac occasionally by mistake. I'm not sure still what keys I'm pressing, but it happens on a semi-regular basis.
It would be
And the
Command
voice,
F5.
Command F5, okay. No, I know. I'll commit that to memory.
There you go.
The voice that your screen reader was reading what was on the screen was phenomenally fast. And I was watching what I was watching at 1.5 speed. And I thought, okay, well, I'll just slow it down to 1 speed. It can't be that fast. And even at 1 speed, it was unintelligible to me. I had no idea what was going on. Is it true that you can listen to that voice, that robotic voice that's reading your screen, up to around 800 words per minute?
Yep, it is. I mean, sometimes I will slow it down if I'm reading, a particularly dense thing, like, I don't know, a legal agreement, right? You want to slow it down a little bit. But I think that really replicates, right? When a sighted person, you'll sometimes read slower when you're reading some dense material. But yes, it hovers around 800, which is something that I always like to talk about because it gives a very clear example of why you as a designer or a developer can't just test a thing and be having the same experience that I'm having, right? Because I'll have someone who's running their voice at, like, I think speaking is like 100 words per minute or something. They'll test with the screen reader and they'll say, there's no way I can make this fast and efficient. It's just too slow and terrible. But, like, first of all, you have the voice way slower. Second of all, you haven't memorized all the shortcut keys to the point where they're muscle memory, right? So that is why it's so important to get the voices of people with disabilities involved in accessibility, because we've been solving these problems and we've been using this tech for our lives, and we have this lived experience to bring to bear that can really help you figure out what isn't working and what is working and move towards solving some of those problems, perhaps even in ways that you yourself might not have even thought of,
100%. And that was that light bulb moment for me when I was watching that demo. It was so foreign to me, this concept that you could listen to something at that speed, make sense of it, and be able to do something with that knowledge. You're right, like it's around about 100, 150 words per minute that we speak at, which must make this conversation for you really painful.
No,
but
one of the interesting things,
remarkable. Your ability to do that's remarkable.
Yeah, one of the interesting things about these screen reader voices is that because we want to go so fast, blind people prefer the robotic voice. And so as, like, technology is improving, like, there are screen reader voices that sound more and more natural, and blind people don't like them because, like, I couldn't listen to you speaking at 800 words per minute, right? You do not intone things exactly the same. You might pronounce the same word slightly differently 2 different times, or put the emphasis on a different syllable. I mean, of course, you've got an accent that I don't hear every day. Whereas the robotic screen reader voice, it always pauses the same amount of time for a comma and a period. It always puts the emphasis in the same place. If you give it a word, it'll say that word the same way 4 times in a row. In fact, in the latest iOS and Mac operating system updates, Apple has gotten a lot of kudos from the blind community for specifically bringing a text-to-speech system called Eloquence to their phones and computers. And the interesting thing about Eloquence is that it was developed in 1998. And so it's a quite old, at this point, speech technology. But blind people, it has been the standard on Windows because it is so robotic that you can listen to it very, very, very quickly. And so Apple, has leading natural voices on iOS and Mac as they work with people who are blind in their testing and their development. It became very clear to them, well, no, wait, we have to modernize and include these really old robotic sounding voices because blind people put so much stock in efficiency and being able to listen quickly.
So it sounds like you can you've internalized the patterns that are inherent within that voice, which
Yeah.
enables you to read at speed.
Yeah, and I think it's one of those things that those insights that only comes to you if you are talking to people with disabilities, right? Intuitively, you'd think, oh, a blind person is using a screen reader and they're listening to this voice every day. So shouldn't I put all of my massive R&D development into making it sound more and more natural and making it sound better and better? Because that's what I'd want in a voice that I have to listen to. And it's only when you are working with people who are blind that you find out that no, that's not the desire, and it doesn't match the use case. But it's like counterintuitive.
Yeah, 100%. One of the recent criticisms of Hollywood has been its casting of non-disabled actors to play disabled characters. So when it comes to, you were talking there about we need to involve people with disabilities in the design of these products. So when it comes to that, is there a parallel there? Is there a danger that design teams who are made up exclusively of non-disabled people, despite their best intentions, forget that they are not their users?
Forget that they're not their users, or think that they understand the needs of their users in ways that they don't. Because we can all think really hard about how to solve the needs of our users, but we're not them. And no matter how much effort we put into trying to be them, we can't be. Right? There was this idea, it's sometimes called simulationism, that like, oh, well, what we should do is we should all wear a blindfold for a day and then we'll learn what it's like to be blind. And like, no, people spend years learning how to be blind. And so the only way to get those insights is to talk to your users who are people with disabilities. And it's also the only way that you'll get to understand the guidelines, right? Too often we fall back on guidelines as like, oh, well, I'm going to check all of the WCAG boxes and then it'll be accessible. And not necessarily. You can make a horrible user interface that follows all of the WCAG guidelines and is still totally inaccessible. An interesting meme I saw floating around a little while ago was the accessible volume control. And what it was like a properly labeled button with all of the correct labels and landmarks and keyboard accessible. And the button was change volume. And every time you pressed it, it set the volume to a random number. But like, if you put that through an accessibility tester, right? Like the button's labeled and if you do automated testing, it's fully compliant. But accessibility is about thinking about the interaction, not just the kind of technical checkboxes for compliance and thinking of like, oh, well, we've complied with all of the guidelines, so we've done everything that we need to do. And like, no, the guidelines are the web content accessibility guidelines, not the web content accessibility commandments written on tablets of stone. And once you have obeyed all of the commandments, you are guaranteed accessibility, right?
Yeah, almost as if there's a posture adopted there where meeting the guidelines is seen as enough.
Mm-hmm. Or all that we need to do, or all of the requirements, right? The guidelines are just a framework.
So I mean, thinking about this challenge that's ahead of us to create a more accessible world, I've heard you say something, and I'll quote you now. You've said, accessible design means design that works for our future selves, because people with disabilities someday will be us, not just these other people. Now, I was reflecting on this yesterday, actually, and where I got to was that there seems to be an ability that is more common in people to maximize for their current state than there is for us to maximize for a potential future state. So how do you encourage people to see past their current degree of ability?
I think it's why I never talk about that future state in isolation, because you're right. People, I mean, when you're 20, you don't believe that you're ever going to get old, right? like you're never going to have arthritis. You don't. And so I think that's also why it is important and interesting to talk about things like situational disabilities, which is the things that we've all experienced, right? You're dependent on the automatic doors because your arms are full of groceries, and you need the curb cut because you're pushing a stroller, and you're needing Siri text-to-speech because you're in your car and need the text message read out to you. I think that makes the idea of change of state and change in ability more palatable to people. And it's the old trick, right? Once you get them to accept that, okay, yeah, my abilities change all the time, then it's easier for people to think about, well, yeah, of course my abilities are going to be different in the future. They're different now, right? I sometimes talk about the cognitive disability, the situational cognitive disability that comes from lack of sleep, right? Maybe you got half an hour of sleep last night, but today you still have to do your banking and you still have to go to work and you still have to accomplish all the things. So they better be accessible and easy to use, because the fact that Brendan didn't get any sleep last night doesn't mean the to-do list magically evaporates, right? Like,
Yeah, I have to still have a somewhat coherent conversation on Brave UX in the morning.
yeah, there you go. But like, how many mistakes have been caused by people who are in an unusual situation for them? And getting older is one of those future states, but like your state and your abilities change all the time based on what you're doing and who you are. And I don't ever mean, I mean, of course you can't directly compare, driving your car and being unable to read your text message to being blind, but it is a useful thought exercise, A, to accept that your capabilities at any given time change, and B, to help understand why more customizable and accessible designs will make things that are better for everyone, because it may enable me to do something for the first time. An example I like to use for this is kind of the smart home. I got a smart thermostat and I got a HomePod, and it was the first time I was able to check the temperature in my home and set it by myself. Right? A real barrier removed there. But it also made it easier for you. You can now check it with your voice. It's easier. It's more convenient. It's better, right? And so when we remove barriers for people with disabilities to make new experiences possible for people who before couldn't do things, we make the experience for us better as well.
I was watching one of your talks late last week, and my son came home from daycare. And bless Teddy, he's a wonderful, full of energy young boy, 4-year-old boy.
So you know what it's like to not have gotten any sleep.
I know. Yeah, well, I know in terms of the sleep thing, but in this particular situation, it was just the noise. I couldn't focus on what it was that you were saying, and so I enabled the caption feature on YouTube. And again, I know you've used this example in other talks yourself, but that was just a very personal and directly relatable experience that I had in preparing for today's conversation. And if that feature wasn't there, I would have had to either have turned the volume way up or come back to it at a later time.
Yeah. And of course, turning the volume way up, now you risk damaging your own hearing if you're using AirPods or anything like that, right?
Which my Apple Watch would tell me that I'm in an environment that's too noisy.
Yeah.
You're also making me think of a conversation I had a few months back with Katie Swindler, who had been studying the human stress response in design. And a number of her case studies were about how our physiology changes our ability to interact, in particular with physical products, and just how the design of certain things like phone keypads and like on the Apple iPhone, the ability to activate the SOS function, how these are critical to enable us in a situational change like that where we're under a lot of pressure. Maybe we've witnessed an accident or something like that. That this can actually be these sorts of affordances in our designs can actually be life and death, and as we've been talking about earlier, contribute a lot to someone's experience in the world being one of dignity as opposed to one of distress.
Yeah, and I think even when it's not life and death. I mean, I was talking earlier about how all of these workarounds that I use are just so second nature to me that I sometimes, they're frustrating, but like it's just what I do. And as I started at Fable, I became sort of more and more aware of these things, right? Because as you're thinking about accessibility and the state of the landscape, you're really being self-reflective. And I also started doing these kinds of presentations and demos and things. And it was actually quite surprising to me how something that I found to be perfectly accessible and thought that I could use without any difficulty was suddenly totally inaccessible and impossible for me to use when I was on a stage demoing it, right? Because the pressure level is suddenly different.
Yeah. Like you were talking with regard to sleep deprivation, it's a similar change in our chemistry, and it changes how we can use things. It further reinforces the importance of actually them being more greatly inherently accessible than when we're in our normal cognition and able to use things, normally in inverted commas there.
And a thing that we can use when we're suffering from sleep deprivation is now a better designed thing that is also easier for us to use normally, right? I'm sure
100%.
we've got
Yeah.
enough stress going on in our lives. I mean, the more we can remove from the world in the way that we design and build our products, the better.
Now, just conscious of time, I want to bring things down to a close in a moment. Before we do that, though, I was curious about this school of thought that seems to exist out there, that accessible designs are simple designs. And I know you spoke very early on in our conversation about that not needing to be the case. And by simple, I mean things that have fewer features or are missing things that the full experience might contain. That sounds to me a lot like the medical model of disability playing out in design.
Yeah, it is. It's the model that says people with disabilities are broken. There's something wrong with them. And so we are now being forced to compensate for the fact that there is something wrong with our users, right? I mean, if you put it that way as a designer, if you said, well, there's something wrong with my users, so I have to change my design, I don't think that's how you do your research at least I hope not, right? And so sort of that's the mindset that we had adopted towards people with disabilities. And it resulted in, I don't know if you remember back in the day, right? There was always the text-only alternative to the website where you'd click and you get the text-only. And of course, that would never be maintained. And, there was the limited feature set and there's things like this. I think the place we really started to see a change in that is with the transition to mobile. Because you probably remember back in the day, right? The mobile app couldn't do as much as the website. And the app would, well, if you want to do that, you have to go to desktop because we have to simplify things for you in mobile because you have a smaller screen. And that very quickly became unacceptable to people. And so I think that was the time and place where designers really started to learn that we can make designs easier and smaller and responsive and fluent without removing features and without simplifying the tasks that we can accomplish. And that learning kind of was carried on in dialogue with accessibility, right? Because as we got to grips with the idea that things can be responsive and customizable and easier to use without removing features, it really also clarified and carried that over into the accessibility space, right? Because now that's a thing that designers can understand, that you have to design things for different modalities, and that doesn't mean simplifying them for the other modality.
Sam, as we bring the conversation down to a close, I have one final question for you. What do I and everyone else who's listening, what do we need to remember if we're going to create a digital world that is accessible for all of us, no matter our ability?
There are so many good answers to that, but I'll boil it down to sort of the key thing, which is that accessibility is a journey and a process. Just like designs are always changing and technology is always changing, we need to make sure that accessibility is iterating to keep up. And the first thing you do when you try to make something more accessible, won't be perfect. And that's okay, as long as it's a little bit better, because accessibility comes through a process of iteration. And for that process to work, we need to be including the voices of people with disabilities so that we can bring that lived experience into the processes and into the iteration. I think that's as pithy as I can make it.
It was wonderfully pithy and a wonderful note to end on. Sam, thank you. This has been such a wonderful way for me to start my day. I really appreciate you sharing your stories and your insights and going to such detail in doing so with me today.
Hey, thanks so much. And to close on what I just said, accessibility is a process and a learning and a conversation. And so I would love if this listening to this episode brought up questions for those of you who are hearing it. Absolutely feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. That's what Brandon did, and I'm here now. So I do get to my LinkedIn messages. But I would love to continue on this journey and this conversation. And you can find out more about me and about what Fable and about what we're up to over at makeitfable.com. And we'd love to help you move the accessibility of your team and your organization forward.
Thanks, Sam. What a great mission. And to everyone who's tuned in, it's been great having you here as well. Everything we've been talking about today will be in the show notes where you can find Sam, where you can find Fable. Everything will be there. Please check them out. If you enjoyed the show and you want to hear more great conversations like this with world-class leaders in UX, design, and product management, don't forget to leave a review on the podcast. Also, share the podcast with just one other person that you think would find value in these conversations at depth, and subscribe so it arrives weekly in whichever app you prefer to listen on. If you want to reach out to me, you can find me on LinkedIn. Just search for Brendan Jarvis. There's also a link to my profile at the bottom of the show notes if you want to find me that way. Or you can head on over to thespaceinbetween.co.nz. That's thespaceinbetween.co.nz. And until next time, keep being brave.